Plywood. It's great to have, but sometimes a challenge to move around. In our last video, I showed you 5 ways to move it around your shop really easily, but sometimes we need to be able to pick it up and just carry it. So for this video, we're going to test out 5 easy ways to pick it up and carry. First up is the panel carry. These run about $10 in my local store, and it says it's good for plywood and drywall and can go up to about 200 pounds. I don't know if I could even carry 200 pounds in one hand, but it says it can do it. Now, I've never actually used this, even though I've had it for a short while, so let's go out and test this. So I walked up to the plywood and started to position the tool in place, but no matter which way I was trying to put it, it wanted to fall over. This is definitely going to make it a little more of a challenge. I then walked over to one side of the plywood and lifted it up and decided to rest it on my foot so I could reach the tool about midway under. Now this is not a deal breaker, but if I had to move a bunch of plywood, my foot would definitely be sore. I next braced for the lift, which actually was surprising. It was much easier and lighter than I thought it was going to be. I really felt that the plywood was going to pull a lot more down on my arm and my shoulder, but it didn't. I surprisingly had a nice firm grip and it was relatively easy to control. I was able to move it back and forth by just shifting my whole body weight, and the plywood easily moved back and forth. But as I was returning it to its original position, again, I had to deal with the tool being difficult to reach. So I knelt down, picked up one side of the plywood, pulled the tool out, and unfortunately had to drop the plywood quickly so my fingers wouldn't get caught under it. I know this isn't good for the plywood, but it was the only way I figured I could get it out. Now I know dropping the wood like that is not good for it, but unfortunately with the little ledge that's on this tool, there wasn't an easy way to do that. I also tried just lifting one side of the plywood, letting the tool fall out, but in most cases it would slide up under the plywood, causing the same problem. Now I guess I could have probably set it back on my foot and tried to do it that way, but again, that's another reason why my foot probably would have hurt later. Overall, other than the installation and withdrawal of this tool, carrying it was really nice. It wasn't hard on my shoulder or my hand. It felt really comfortable, so it's definitely an option for you. Now for number 2, I've seen a few people take a long thick rope, tie a loop in both ends, and use it to pick up the plywood. I've never tried that before either, so let's give it a shot. Starting off with just some basic rope, I tied a small loop and a knot in one end. Now I was never into Boy Scouts, so I don't know this perfect way to tie a knot, just like I'm guessing most of you don't either. I then stretched the rope out so that it was about even across the plywood and tied a secondary loop in that end as well. I then gave it a quick test fit and realized that the rope was starting to cut into my hands, so I figured the best bet was to go and grab a pair of gloves. The gloves worked pretty well, but I realized that the rope was coming up way too high. I needed to adjust it just a little bit. So I took it off one end and tried to retie another loop to see if this would work any better. Now I'm not exactly sure what I did wrong, but the loop quickly slipped off the end of the plywood and it came crashing to the floor. Fortunately, my foot or anything else was not under it. Now I'd seen other people use this technique successfully, so I knew there was something I did wrong. So I readjusted a loop, tried to tie another knot, and attempted it one more time. And fortunately, this time it worked great. I was able to lift it up, I was able to move my body back and forth, and the plywood went with me with ease, and I was able to set it down without a problem. Now this is a technique you could definitely use in a pinch if you had some thick rope and some gloves. Without the gloves, it was real hard on my hands, so I probably wouldn't recommend that. But I mean, I guess if that's all you had, you could use it that way as well. Make sure you tie some good knots and some good loops. I'm not the best at this, so I can't give you the exact way to do that, but just test it out. You'll figure it out. And overall, it is a decent technique once you figured it out, but it does take a little trial and error. Now I recently saw somebody trying to carry some plywood with some ratchet straps. And I was thinking, that sounds like an interesting idea. You have hooks on each end and an adjustable center. So let's give this a shot. I walked up to about the center of the board and I placed the hooks about 18 inches apart. This should give some stability to the plywood when I'm lifting it. I then had to lift each side of the plywood, making sure the hook was placed into position. This was a little bit of a challenge because as I lifted one side, the other side of the hook sometimes would fall, but after a little adjustment, I figured it out. I then tried to give it a quick test lift and realized that the strap was way too long. Good thing these are adjustable because that made easy work of making it much shorter. And with a slow, steady lift, the plywood came up really easily. This reminded me of the panel carry that we used earlier. It gave me real stability and strength. I was able to twist and turn, and the plywood worked with me without any issues. I then wondered how easy it would be to remove the hooks, so I carefully set the plywood back down and lifted up just one corner, and both of the hooks fell out of position. I was then easily able to just pull them out. Now, I was quite surprised just how easy it was to use a ratchet strap to lift up your plywood. Now, keep in mind though that this is very little surface area here on each of these hooks. So if this is going to be plywood that you're maybe going to use for display or on a nice panel, there is a chance that these small little surface area here could gouge or dent that plywood. So be careful with that. But otherwise, if you're just going to use this for basic plywood, maybe just on walls or just something that's not all that important, definitely try out your ratchet straps. Now for number 4, I wanted to see if I could do a little DIY tool, and I came up with this setup. I just have some basic rope here that I've measured out for my height and where I'd like the plywood to be when I'm carrying it. On this end was just a wooden dowel that I drilled some holes in and put the rope through, so now I have a nice gripping handle. And I made myself a hook down here. This was just some metal conduit that I beat flat and then bent it into shape and drilled a hole through. You don't have to have this. You could use an old hook or maybe even some old fencing that, as long as it has a nice U shape to it and has a hole in it, you can use it. So let's go test this out. I walked up to about the center of the plywood, positioned the hook in place, I lifted one corner of the plywood up, and the hook just slid right in. I wanted to make sure this wasn't just a fluke, so I had to repeat this process. And as you can see here, it went in just as easy the second time as well. I then wanted to test the mobility of the plywood, and it did very well. Now, the independent nature of the rope made it slightly tougher when I was trying to move back and forth, especially compared to, say, the panel carry, which was very rigid, but overall it did very well. Now, to remove the tool, I just lifted up one side of the plywood and the hook fell right out. Now, for those of you who like the DIY nature and you have some scraps laying around, it's a great way to make yourself a tool and possibly save yourself some money. And for number 5, this is a tool I just recently learned about myself. This is a top lift tool. Basically, you stick this on the top of your plywood and you go to lift up, and as you do, it clamps really hard and allows you to lift it up. This is probably great for those of you who possibly have a bad back or you're just not good at bending over and picking stuff up. So let's go give this a shot. When I first walked up to the plywood, it did take me just a second to figure out how to adjust the tool, but it was really simple. I then gave it a test lift and realized I didn't have to bend over at all. In fact, I was using all my leg strength to lift this. And once I had it up in the air, I realized I could carefully move it completely around just with one hand, even though I do recommend using 2 to make it a little bit easier. And to remove the tool was super simple. I just gently lifted, making sure it wasn't grabbing the plywood, and it came right off. One thing that did concern me about the clamp was the rough nature of the jaws, which reminded me of about 60 grit sandpaper. And after inspecting the plywood, there was a couple real minor indentations. Overall, I was very impressed with this lifting clamp. Now, if you're going to be using your plywood for some fine woodworking, I probably wouldn't use this setup because the rough nature of the jaws could scratch it or put little indents in it. But otherwise, this right here is a great way to move your plywood around. Now, if by chance you're interested in this tool, I'll put a link to this in the description. They run about $30, so make sure you check it out. Now, I hope one of these ideas will make your woodworking experience a little bit more enjoyable. Now, here's the next video the algorithm thinks you'll like.